I gotta work on that audio loop. It cut out kind of right in the middle of the good part. I gotta wait for the down. Hi, everybody. My name is Logan Edmonds. I'm CEO of TTS. I am joined today by founder and VCISO of Vocivity, Matt Garish. Hi, Matt. How you doing, man?
Hey, Logan. I'm doing great. It's good to be here.
Good to be here. Well, we're off to. Oh, somebody's giving me a hard time on LinkedIn. Oh no, I'm just kidding. That's for you actually. So yeah, welcome to our webinar today. We're going to be talking about the new SEC regs. They've been in effect now for a little over a month, right? I think we're just over a month here, just shy.
Yep. Yeah,
So
early December.
maybe on the off chance you didn't hear about this, and actually, I'll be honest, I feel like they were a little low profile. Like I knew about it because of the forums and groups I'm in, but there wasn't a big, like a lot of fanfare announcement I felt on these regulations compared to like say the FTC safeguards that came out last year. Like that was everywhere, but I think a lot of people just kind of assumed, okay, what is this? We'll figure it out when we figure it out. I mean, I was talking to somebody the other day who does cyber risk advisement, and I was like, "Did you hear about them? Like, have you looked at this?" And he's like, "I didn't even realize they were alive yet." I'm like, "That's not good, dude. Probably should stay more on top of that." Well, let's go ahead and dive right in, I guess, and we'll dive into the meat of today's topic.
Yeah,
Thanks for
absolutely.
coming in, and thank you for joining us live. We're super stoked to have you too. I'm working comments as they come in. We're going to pause throughout this presentation. Obviously, some people are going to have some questions. That's totally fine. Uh, Feel free to ask, and we'll leave like 60-second gaps throughout this whole thing. So, our title of today's webinar is quite simply navigating the SEC regulations. Well, what exactly makes us qualified to talk about that? Let's start there, right? Like, why would you listen to us two bozos? My wife would probably ask the same question. I'm kidding. Love you, babe. My name is Logan Edmonds. I'm CEO of TTS. We're an MSSP. We do cyber risk advisement, proactive cybersecurity on the not strategy side, the tactical side of things. So think like managed SOC, think like, intrusion detection. We're the guys that actually do the tactical response work, the stuff of making sure your technology works properly and is also fairly locked down in conjunction with your overall security strategy. Matt, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah. So I'm Matt Garish. My focus is primarily on uh, security leadership strategy. I do a lot of compliance work, building information security programs, uh, policy development, process documentation, process improvement, and advisory. I help my clients build their security programs and get ready for SOC 2 audits. Is one of the big things that I do a whole lot. But yeah, help them strategically focus on the right things to build their programs that are like right sized to the business and really aligned to what they're trying to do in the organization, so that it's a fit, and so security is an enabler for them instead of a point of friction.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, good security policies should both protect the business and also enable it to hit that next level without having to skip a beat. I 100% love what you do. I'm going to give a personal shout out to Matt's quality of work. We are, as of 3 days ago now, SOC 2 Type 2 compliant, huzzah. And Matt was the guy that helped us get that ball rolling, did our pre-assessment. We're very happy what he did, which is why, of course, when the time came to do this webinar, first guy I thought of, hey, Matt, you got some opinions on this? So we're really glad to have you, Matt.
Yeah, that's great to hear. Congratulations on wrapping that up. That's a lot of work.
A year of life and a few gray hairs, but we're through it. So understanding these new requirements, right? Like, what the heck are these SEC requirements? The Form 8K, the Form 10K. We're going to get into all of that. Broadly speaking, we're going to talk real quick here. The new cybersecurity rules. They really, however, changed the tone to be more emphasized on proactive cybersecurity measures, where a lot of the legalese surrounding this up to this point from the SEC side, from my understanding, asterisk not a lawyer, was more about the reactive stuff, right? Like, what are the penalties? What is the civil litigation? This is more of a focus and force to have publicly traded companies proactively address this kind of stuff before the breaches happen. And it's setting very broad guidelines for it. For example, one of the central requirements is the timely reporting of cybersecurity incidents. We're going to talk about that in a minute, but you need to report them within a reasonable time frame. They've put what the official language is 4 days after you determine its material, which we're going to get into what that means a little further on. And also, you need to file an annual assessment of what exactly does your cybersecurity program look like. So you're on the record of what kind of stuff are you doing, What is the expertise that's with your company? Whole bunch of stuff. Matt, you want to chime in here a little bit on your take on this, like as far as the broad strokes?
Yeah, and I don't want to. I have to take issue, I think, with reasonable there, because the 4-day timeline they gave is really, really tight.
I meant for 10K.
From
To
the
be clear. For
Yeah,
10K, for 10K, I thought it was reasonable.
so
8K, no.
yeah. So, I think that is a piece that, I have a little bit of concern there, that with 4 days from the point that you determine that something is material that you have to report it, that's not much time to collect information when you're in the middle of an incident response. So I think folks are going to be reporting, and we're very likely to have folks reporting with partial or incomplete information. That over time, we'll have to see whether that becomes a problem, and they need to revise any of this, or whether that ends up being workable.
Yeah, I'm very concerned about that myself. So I get a lot of the counter to this, and we'll talk about this in the Form AK slide, is whether or not something's material, and you get time to determine that. I get that. But you, in an ideal world, would determine something's material before you engage forensics and IR for the full tilt. And you're making your PR statements off that. And we'll talk about that later. You're making your public press releases, your forms themselves, your representations to the government. 4 days is not a lot of time to get your house in order on any kind
No.
of major cyber incident. Most of the time, the ones I've been involved with, we're looking at timelines of 30 to 45 days usually before we have that kind of detail.
Yeah. And if you're figuring out how to go through that process while you're going through it, it's gonna make it that much harder.
And the other question people are asking me, and I hope this is pretty self-evident by the title of our webinar, but who does this affect exactly, right? It affects all publicly traded companies. There is no size limits. There is nothing like that. You're publicly traded. You're also, side note, it also affects foreign private issuers registered in the United States as well. That's a minute category, but it's still relevant. But if you're publicly traded, if your company has any kind of stock or security, you're under this banner, and you are under enforcement from the SEC. Okay, cybersecurity risk. I've heard so many definitions of what exactly constitutes a cybersecurity risk, and that's fair. It's a big field, like it's a ginormous field. There's a lot of disciplines. For the purpose of today's conversation, I did create a definition, and this is about as dry and verbatim as we're going to get on this. But the way I define cybersecurity risk for our audience is it refers to the potential for unauthorized access, use, disclosure, disruption, modification, or destruction of information in a business. It can also entail financial losses, damage to an organization's reputation, and legal repercussions. It is influenced by a firm's use of technology, the nature of its business operations, and the strategies in place to safeguard against a range of vulnerabilities and threats. Getting more tactical and to the weeds of what exactly, give me examples, right? Okay, here's some examples of real cybersecurity risks that we're going to be tactical, specifics. Phishing emails can be real cybersecurity risks. We all know how bad phishing is. I probably get at least 2 or 3 a day minimum, and that's with all the proper security programs and technology stacked on it. Right? They somehow get through. Ransomware, you have to be hiding under a rock not to have heard what ransomware is and what it does. I think that's probably the most publicized form of cybersecurity risk that's out there. Cybersecurity risk can be as simple as outdated software. So patch your stuff, patch your servers, patch your computers, patch your mobile devices. There was a. Were you involved at all with the WLP bug, Matt? Did you have that, the lip WP bug?
Nothing hit any of my clients that I had to deal with any of
Oh,
that with,
dear
thankfully.
Lord, the list for that vulnerability remediation was pages and pages for us. The moment it dropped on our vulnerability, it was like this 100 instances of Zoom, this 300 instances of Google Chrome, this, hey, all these people have Notepad++. Why does everyone have Notepad++? That was a nightmare to deal with. And that's the kind of stuff that is absolutely considered a cybersecurity risk. The software is outdated. Hackers figure out how to break it. It's a risk now. And also, of course, compliance costs. That's going to be a central theme of today's meeting. If you get caught in any kind of perceived negligence by a regulator or by any kind of legal event with civil disputes, lawyers are expensive. That's pretty common logic. Lawsuits are expensive. Nobody wants them. Nobody needs them. We want to avoid them. So there's a cost of getting involved with them, and we want to stay away from it. Okay. Also, we're going to talk about risk management today. And I think it's important for our audience to understand we're going to focus on the 5 key principles of risk management, and we're going to address how it relates to this risk during this webinar. So there are 5 key ways to manage any kind of risk, not just cyber. And this is a very gross simplification, but for the purpose of today's call, this is what we're going to go with. Avoidance, where you just avoid the risk altogether. You can't really have a whole lot of risk of getting in a car accident if you don't drive and you don't ride in cars, for example. Retention, you could just choose not to do anything about it, retain the risk, say it's acceptable, and move on with your life. You can share the risk in a lot of cases. A great example of this is, you have a contractual obligation with someone where you say, I take responsibility for these areas and you take responsibility for these areas. And depending on where the bad incident falls, it's not my problem, right? That you're sharing the risk with someone. Transferring is probably the most popular and well-known form of risk management. That's your typically your insurer. You get an insurance policy. Go out and buy some insurance. If something bad happens, I'm covered. The insurer has agreed to absorb or transfer my risk to them and make it their problem. And the last but not least, and it's kind of blocked out by your face, Matt, so I'm going to read it out loud: loss prevention and loss reduction. You need to figure out how to reduce risk, right? You can do proactive stuff to reduce risk and figure out how to be proactive on minimizing what I call your risk footprint. Do you disagree with any of those, or you want to add on to any of those?
Yeah. When you look at this, the loss prevention, loss reduction is the bulk of your information security program. That is your internal controls that you're putting in place to mitigate risk. So that's where the bulk of the investment you're making goes. Cyber insurance prices have been going up, which is making the decision of doing transference
I
a little more difficult.
the
Uh,
grapevine they're going to come again
the
next year too. They're hitting those quotas. The premiums are not quite meeting the payouts.
From a business perspective, avoidance is often difficult because it's hard to push limits and drive things forward and avoid risk. Risk is where profit comes
Yeah.
from in business. So you can do a little bit of risk avoidance with making sure you're not collecting more data than you need. When we get into private data or sensitive information, if you don't collect it and store it, that lowers the data footprint and the some of the risk that you may
Under
have.
risk reduction
Uh,
though a little bit, because
and
like avoidance in my mind is
it
I just avoid using computers. Like I just completely avoid
yeah,
risk, right? Like it's not practical in this conversation at all. Like what you're talking about
it
reducing data, I'd honestly put that in reduction, right? Like if I minimize
it
my data footprint, I'm reducing my overall amount of liability I could have in any kind of theoretical incident.
it can you are sort of mitigating a risk, but at the same time, you're also avoiding just having certain pieces of data even in your possession that could be
Oh,
breached. But at the same time, with like I said, with business, driving things forward, that's often difficult to do as you're looking to go into new markets or, new partnerships with, suppliers or other, folks in vertical integration and supply chains and those types of things. So, and obviously, the one right in the center, um, on there is where basically
oh,
you accept the
go back.
risk. Yeah, you say, Yep, we get it. We understand that that's a risk, and that's a risk we're willing to take, and you mark it on your risk register that you've accepted that risk, and you're not gonna do anything particularly to mitigate it. We're not gonna spend that money to do that. We're gonna invest in other places. We're just gonna invest
I
it.
like I like
Uh, sharing
Philip Swain just commented, if I don't need people. And I'm like, yeah, that's fair. If I don't need people, I don't have to worry about
Mhm,
risk. Yeah, sure.
yep,
No people, no business,
a
no
and
risk.
and sharing doesn't, I think, feel like that probably comes up the least, in the stuff that I'm working on, at least with clients, but, that can exist where you've got suppliers or a cloud provider or somebody and you're, sharing some of the risk, with that, shared responsibility model that exists with cloud.
I 100% agree. Um, and that makes more sense when you lay it out, right? Like there's some stuff you can avoid. And I'm not saying, I think for all of these, it's kind of a question mark because what we're going to see at the end, and we're not hiding the ball here, 100% risk reduction or risk avoidance or risk retention or risk sharing or risk transference is just not on the table. No matter what category you go to,
Mhm.
that is not on the table here. There's things you can do in all
Yep.
of this that you as a business, and that's kind of goes into my next slide. Risk management overall is always going to be a business leadership decision. Um, I've seen a lot of in the early days. We're seeing it a lot better on the tactical side of it, especially in like the smaller company range of public. I think like sub 100, sub 200 employees. We'll just make this the director of IT's job, right? Like he does all the cyber risk management, and tell us something goes wrong from the leadership team, the CXO team. That's just not really practical. Information security inherently is risk management, and risk management is inherently handled by the CXO team. CFO handles financial risk. COO handles operational risks. Chief legal officer handles legal risk. Right? Like these are all things that are inherent to the roles of the business leadership. And so when you define how to manage your cyber risk program, it really needs to be a leadership decision, or at least leadership participation needs to be in there. And it needs to concur with two primary things. Any business leader worth their salt would agree vision is 100% central to the business operation. Your risk management program should align with your vision and what you're trying to achieve, and it should align with your mission. If you take the risk management program outside of those two areas, it's going to be really hard to get adoption across the board because your entire company is swiveled around these two things. So your risk management program has to be as well. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is one of those things that we struggle with because folks in security, they may look to best practices and like, we're gonna do these things. Why are we doing those things? Like that's really the important part. We can't just blindly be doing the quote unquote best practices. We've got to understand our why. Why are we doing what we're doing when it comes to security? How does this fit into the bigger picture? And how is security going to enable the business to succeed? And, yes, security can be a business enabler. Like that's a big piece of it that folks struggle with, even in the security industry, struggle with because it's so often viewed as a source of friction and a cost center when it really can be able to drive business. And, if you look at it as a function of process quality and assurance, you can give your customers a greater uh, a degree of assurance to do business with you. Through your security program, if you can articulate your security program well and present it well with third party assessment reports and those types of things, just as one example to help you win new business. But beyond that, it can be woven into the DNA of the entire organization. And if you don't treat it as an afterthought that, okay, here's what we're going to do. Okay, now we can bring in the security people to make it secure. Start from the beginning and include them. The security team, your security officer can help you make sure that you have the right people, the right processes, the right technologies in place to enable achieving your strategic objectives safely. And I think that's really the big thing here, is to make it cooperative because too often security ends up being the department of
There's
no.
also there's
And
also so again no right like so a lot of security management teams I have seen. I want to comment one more thing, and I want to pause for questions. Right, like we're a little bit delayed. I think there's like a 20-second delay, so I want to take a couple minutes to allow questions in the chat. Philip has been awesome, by the way. Philip is absolutely on point. He says, if I don't need date of birth or social security numbers, I don't need to gather the data and store that data. I agree 100% with that statement. If you don't need it, don't keep it. Like data hoarders should be some kind of trash television series, not a practice in business. I used to like the show hoarders. Sorry.
yeah,
But
but
what I was going to get,
yeah, but just to,
what I was going to get, sorry, I got off topic. A lot of times what I'm
yeah,
doing is I'll defer this to someone downstream, and this guy is horrendously overworked. He doesn't know what he's doing. He sees the alarm bells on the risk management program, but he doesn't have that direct path to leadership, right? Like he needs help, or he needs buy-in from leadership to make real change happen to actually accomplish the program's objectives, and he doesn't have a path to achieve that. So, or they, I should say they, like it's gender neutral here, obviously, but like they don't have a path to achieve that, and they're being set up for failure in a lot of ways, right? Like a risk program needs to have some kind of path where leadership can escalate and participate in, or because you're gonna need to cut through some red tape sometimes.
yep. And buy-in is huge. Like you've got to build those relationships with folks in other functions to do that. So when they come to you in security, when they come to us in security, instead of saying no, you can't do that, and it's just supposed to be over and done, the real answer is like, well, maybe not like that, but let's understand what we are trying to accomplish here. Make this a team thing, not, and I have to approve this thing. What are we trying to accomplish? And make sure we have the right people and processes and technology in place to achieve that outcome. If you focus on outcomes and focus on solving the problems of other folks in other functions in the business, it gets a whole lot easier to get that buy-in and to get people behind what you're doing. Because if you can help them achieve what they need to do and do it in a safe way,
Mhm.
security becomes a byproduct of that operational excellence, that process quality that I talked about first, by having the right people and process and technology in place to do it safely. And so you're not investing in security directly, you're investing in these other things that enable outcomes, and systems and tools and other things. But a byproduct of that becomes that
So
operational excellence and process quality that brings security with it.
So let's pause here for a second because we do want participation from the audience. I see several people are joining us on LinkedIn. If you've joined us on YouTube and some through our main page, welcome. Before we dive into the meat of the SEC specific requirements, which is what we're going to next,
Mhm.
we just got done discussing risk management program about what risk management is in cyber risk world and basic tenets of how to manage it. Are there any questions or comments from the audience to contribute to this conversation or that you'd like us to elaborate a little bit more on? We're going to go ahead and do a 60-second timer on the video here. And once we come back, we'll be answering those. But please go ahead and type those in, put them in the chat. We want to be available to answer you guys. I'm going to put this. Maybe we're going to have a little video. Didn't like me. Ah, found it. Okay. And we're back. I tried to pick like soothing tones for this webinar because I know we both get a little fired up about this topic. And so you like it so far, ukulele and like smooth soothing. Are you enjoying this, Matt?
I think some bagpipes.
No, no dirt. We're not playing a dirge. We're not there yet. There is hope, guys. We can do this. All right. So let's start talking about the requirements. That's I think what the majority of our audience is here today to learn about. So the broad requirements of the SEC new disclosure rules. So it really kind of boils down to, and there is more to this. I'm going to preface this entire slide with saying neither you nor I are practicing attorneys. At the end of the day, you have specifics about the regulations. You should always take this to your general counsel or in-house counsel and get their final say on that. We have heavy metal flute. Philip says he likes heavy metal flute, and I'm like, yes. We do get a question here. Let me go ahead and put this up. So before we go into this, actually, I guess we were a little too quick to dive in. Ishwan, I'm going to put this on the screen for you, sir, says, can you talk about entry-level opportunities in GRC compliance and risk assessment field? Sorry, Ishwarya. I apologize. I said the wrong name. Matt, I'm going to let you go first on that one. Can you talk about entry-level opportunities you're seeing in the GRC compliance and risk assessment field?
Yeah. Um, it it can be very difficult to break into the security field, but GRC is one of the areas where you can still get in at an entry level role as long as it's in an org that is got folks that can coach and guide and train you. Uh, Pivoting into GRC in an org where you're the only person, you don't have that. That's not going to be an entry level thing because you have to understand the interconnections between the controls, how an organization operates, how the infrastructure works, and all of that. But uh, when you're looking for entry level roles, uh, GRC is is one of the ones that I suggest to folks to look for when they're trying to get into entry level, because you can get into that through audit, being an auditor or assessor, um, doing security assessments. Primarily, you can get into it just helping to maintain the data and chase down different pieces of the program, make sure that following up with folks, making sure that they're doing what you need to do. Like there's sort of a project management, program management component of it as well. So it is an area that folks can pivot from other fields into pretty easily, especially if they have experience in certain pieces of things, inventory management. For instance, maybe in another line of work like retail or something, pivoting into something like that gets easier.
So yeah, I'm gonna only add into what you said. I think it's great. I think there's a real need to, and I will make one more adjustment for emotional intelligence inside of risk assessment. Being able to communicate various risk right now. There's a lack of soft skills in the industry. Like a lot of what we assume risk assessment to be is this dry. I don't want to pick on Varonis, but like dry Varonis report, right? Like a big binder. I literally had. I'm always not pick on Varonis, guys. I'm not hating on Varonis. I had a boss once who got these Varonis like technical risk assessments. They were binders like this thick. He used them, literally used them as a doorstop. Like he would go and like slap it down the door, and I would hold his front door open. Like I remember that. I'm thinking, I don't think that's what that's for, sir. But yeah, no, you can do that in a lot of ways. The biggest thing you can do right now, in my opinion, is what Matt said 100%, but also work on developing soft and empathetic skills for communication so that you can bottom line this for the executives that are ultimately making decisions around these kind of reports. If they can't translate what you're saying into actionable intel, that is a real problem for your organization. And there's a real need for that. More and more, I'm seeing people looking for that person when they look to hire those entry level roles. I can train GRC stuff. Soft skills are a lot harder to find and train inside the organization.
And compliance requirements like this are going to drive the GRC field.
Absolutely. So we have
this SEC stuff is going to drive folks needing to bulk up their GRC roles in their orgs to be able to comply.
So we got a ton of questions. I think the chat had a little bit of a blurb, so I want to make sure we take a second to go through all of these, Matt. So Becky Miller posted, how can one effectively raise cybersecurity red flags to upper management that refuses to listen or acknowledge? Oh boy, I like this one. Can I start with this one? Are you okay with that?
Yeah, and we'll talk about this, I think, a little bit later in some of the other
So
slides as well. But yeah, this is a good
we're
one.
going to skip up. So risk assessments are amazingly effective at communicating this risk. Because we're in a world right now where cyber risk, even the most under the rock executive understands it exists and they're not immune to it at this point. That's what I've been finding. Even especially at the publicly traded level, what we're talking about today, like that's just not an argument I hear made anymore. I one time had a C-level executive make an argument with me, and then he got dragged into a bunch of calls with the lawyers about a very mild incident they had 3 years prior for an hour, where they grilled us as the IR team and him for the C-level executive on how we were taking it. Do we still have logs? And he never commented again about why we have to do cybersecurity, right? Like, and that was years ago. We recommend a cybersecurity risk assessment, and it's a very easy buy-in. You don't know what you don't know. What you want is data and delivery that you can then take to your leadership in a way they can understand and say, hey, here's real risk for the organization. And specifically when it comes to executives, and Matt, you can comment on this. I'm a big believer in communicating in terms of dollars because it's a universal language of business leadership that everybody understands. If you can translate risk into a realistic financial cost for the organization in a worst case scenario or others, you now have actionable intel to drive the engagement. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I want to before I go ahead, like sometimes we've got to also be able to let some of these things go. Um, when it really comes down to it, risk management is about managing risk, not eliminating. You're never going to be 100% secure. And that center box in there that we were talking about is the business leadership deciding we're going to accept those risks. But now the piece that gets to what Becky is asking here is you've got to make sure that you've documented this stuff and communicated it in a consistent and factual way, not scare,
No
FUD,
fun.
fear, uncertainty,
You
and
do need to
doubt.
put that out there right
It's got to be
now.
factual and
Oh,
objective.
sorry. Go ahead, Matt. Go ahead. I talked over you. Go ahead.
Yeah, factual and objective in plain English. And like Logan said, maybe translate it into dollars if it is possible to to do that. But ultimately, the business has to decide how much risk they're going to take on. So you've got to help them understand how much risk they're taking on or they're agreeing with here so that they can do that. But if the decision is made, we're not going to invest there. That documentation is huge, and you've got to document the sign off and the decision, and maybe a review
There's like
piece that you're going to come back and review that annually and make sure that are we still good with that decision. But at that point, somebody who actually is accountable for that risk has to be able to make that decision. Now, if you're in an organization where you've got executives that are refusing to document risk and refusing to put in place the governance to handle this in the
I ain't
process,
gonna
that may be a little different, and that may be a sign that you might not be a good place because those are the organizations where the security folks end
talk
up
about that too.
kind of inheriting all of that risk on them, and it can become a career liability. So, if you can't get the governance established and get the business aligned on deciding how they're going to decide to evaluate these risks and accept or not or decide to mitigate, if that piece of governance isn't there, you can try to convince that, but if even that fails, you may not be able to do anything. But I think most, business leaders are trying to do the right thing and want to do the right thing,
Yeah.
and it's just a matter of getting it in
So
front of them in a way that's clear
one
to them and understandable in their vocabulary.
one thought I leave on this too. Like obviously, I don't think the majority of business leadership wants to unduly burden staff with risk exposure, right? Like that is not
No,
the intent.
absolutely not.
There are a few bad actors out there, 100%. That does happen, and you should always take proactive care when dealing with this kind of a topic to cover your own butt and bless for vernacular everyone can understand. That being said, one of the things that stuck with me, I have a buddy who runs IR forensics for internal threat response for a larger publicly traded company. We're talking high five figures on the staff count. And he told me when he writes up these reports, right, for executive risk, when they have to do a hostile termination for various reasons, he focuses the majority of his time on that first page. Why that first page? The binder is about 32 pages long. He says that's the only page anyone on the leadership team is going to read. And that's the page they talk about when they debrief with chief legal counsel and everything else. That's the conversation component. The rest of that binder is for the lawyers, right? If they don't need to go back and review the case, like it has its role. But being able to succinctly, I don't want to say bottom line because that's a crude way of framing it, but be able to succinctly articulate when the opportunity presents itself, the risks that are being identified by the organization in a way that the other person can understand and relate to, the empathetic emotional intelligence. I cannot undersell the importance of that skill set. You can make huge inroads in an organization if you develop the soft skills because you know how to speak a language that your leadership understands. Oh, Becky posted another question. She said, thank you. You are quite welcome, Becky. All right, we have one more and we're going to keep on going. Colby just posted, what are the most effective measures an organization can take to protect sensitive data and ensure cybersecurity in an increasing connected and digital environment? Yeah, that one was going to get into the weeds. There's a whole lot of ways to answer that. I would say identifying what we talked about before, though, identifying risk exposure based on your specific business, because every business has its own applications and how it relates in the industry. For example, a biotech company will have way more sensitivity to permanent loss of data because they run their entire life around intellectual property. They cannot have that getting out into the wild. If you're an up and coming drug manufacturer who hasn't released the product yet, your IP is your lifehood. Like you're not selling a drug yet. You're developing the drug. That's a huge risk intolerance. If you have for example, your organization has a SharePoint site that's exposed to the internet, you stumble on that. Yeah, that needs to get closed ASAP, as opposed to an agricultural industry, for example. Is there risk? Absolutely, and you want to have that discussion, but it's not the immediate. Oh crap! I have to do this now, and I need to put in mitigations now. The appetite for how much they're willing to retain might be a little bit different in those two scenarios. Matt, would you agree on that, or do you have a different thought?
Yeah, I think that's
I use like a gross negligence scenario, and that's not
really
the
good.
conversation. But yeah,
It's a really good take, and I know how hard you're trying not to get into the technical weeds because there's all sorts of technical solutions you can do to protect data. I think probably to give you a tangible tactical answer to your question, I think the biggest thing that orgs can do that's going to have a real impact on their ability to protect their data is build data flow diagrams.
so
when I do assessments of organizations,
Mine.
folks generally will have architecture diagrams. They'll have these logical diagrams of the architecture of their systems. Very, very few have data flow diagrams to keep track of where the data lives, what may have access to it, where it goes in the systems, and those types of things. And I think
So,
getting that stuff documented so that you have up-to-date current data flow diagrams of where the data lives in your system, where it's going, and what systems are using it, having access to it, out to third parties, including, SAS and third parties and partners and folks that you have to share data with. Having all of that mapped out is going to be critical, uh, to building the rest of your program. And I don't know if it's a secret exactly, but as at some point we are going to have privacy legislation that affects everybody across the board. Like right now, we've got
I
certain
think we're
states with
moving
it,
closer
but
to.
this is going to be one of the biggest things you can possibly do in your org to get ready for that, because you will then know where is this private data and where is it going in the systems and what has access to it, so that you can then really build the right privacy policy and controls around that private data.
Yeah, I think that this is coming whether businesses want to have it or not in terms of the consequences of bad management. And I don't want to flood here because that again, we are all about education, not fear of uncertainty and doubt. I when you right now, one of the things that I've done, I would say 9 times out of 10 when I present to a business leadership, the CFO, COO, even CEO, depending on the size of the organization, a risk assessment executive summary, and I've translated it well into a way they can understand. They are absolutely wanting to play ball. Like their jaw drops, like, oh my gosh, we didn't realize it was this bad. Let's go for it. You do occasionally get the 1 out of 10. They're like, I don't believe you, right? Like, and there's nothing you can do about that. But holding by your moral authority right now and saying, hey, look, I'm going to stand by what I said. We did a risk assessment a while ago, Matt. You might remember this because you've done a few of these with us, where the organization just didn't believe the amount of risk they had, nor did they want to entertain the budget that they probably needed to put into managing the risk program, and they tried to go about doing it a different way. Through various avenues, we hear 2 years later, they ended up implementing, after hiring multiple security officers and a bunch of programs, a cybersecurity program that was about 10% over what the budget was we proposed they needed to put in place at the time, right? Like, and at the time we were laughed out of the room. Like, there's just no way. It sucks. I wish I could. I don't know how we could present it better, but time does reveal all. And the honest truth is, organizations are going to have to get more proactive about this. So look, we've answered the questions here, and I know we're running up against the clock, Matt. Let's dive into the requirements here.
Yeah.
So, first thing it boils down to in these SEC requirements, the Form 10K and the Form 8K. 10K is pretty standard in my opinion. But let's start on 8K because that's probably the one we're gonna have the most meat. 8K is not fun to say the least. So from the time you determine that an incident or a event is quote unquote material, according to the reading, again, not a lawyer, go ask your general counsel if you have legal questions on this. Uh, you have 4 days, 4 business days, according to the SEC, with one exception. If it impacts national security, there is a path for you to delay that disclosure. That is the only exception that I could see written into the rules. Within 4 days, you need to file what's called a Form 8K. That is a public form that anybody can look at, which means, practically speaking, you're going to have to do some kind of PR statement, disclose the broad scope of what happened. 4 days, we kind of touched on this earlier. Um, it's kind of an insane timeline. Like, I get where people are coming from, right? Like we have the materiality language that gives us a little bit of runway. So maybe it's 30 days after the event happened, we determine it's material. But as we talked about before, I don't determine an event's material after I engage forensics, after I engage full incident response. Usually I determine an event's material and then I call those guys in, right? Uh, and typically when I've done forensics or IR, it depends on the organization, depends on the event. I'm usually looking bare minimum 2 or 3 weeks for any kind of tangible report to be in my hands that I get actually ready to review from the forensic team. 4 days is a cry shy. Like it's just so far off from that. What's your take on that?
Yeah, in the IRs that I've been involved with, I think the determination of materiality likely is going to happen a little bit into the IR. You've
Well,
realized you have an
let's
incident, but at that point, you don't know how broad, you don't fully understand the
let's
impact.
define it.
and the
response.
scope of
Let's
it.
define incident
So,
response here real quick too, because that's fair. So a
yeah.
lot of internal teams are already doing incident response, right? Like we had some kind of alert from our SOC SIM tool. We had some kind of, thing we needed to address, some kind of malware detection. Like you're doing the basic, maintenance, investigating, whatever, right? And getting like a general sense of, is this a nothing burger or is this something we actually need to do something with, right? I would say when I meant IR, it's, oh crud, this is not a nothing burger. Like there is something here enough that if we don't do due diligence, we're putting ourselves in a precarious position. We need to call in our forensics firm. If we have one internally, great. Otherwise, most people will have one on retainer. We offer that service, obviously. There's other competitors out there. Most people have heard of Mandiant. That's who I think of in that kind of scenario, like a Mandiant or an Arctic Wolf. You're going to call those guys, right? And generally, your insurance policy may or may not pay for them, and there's a retainer and all that fun stuff. So by the time you throw out the paperwork, by the time you get them in your environment, assuming you have everything properly, is 4 days, business days, to be fair. So let's say best case scenario, it's determined on a Wednesday and there's a weekend. So we got till Tuesday of next week, Monday of next week, right? Is that enough time to do this in your mind?
And I mean, when you think about a normal incident response, your first priority is going to be focusing on stability and containing whatever's going on, moving on to eradicating, and then the forensics of what actually fully
Well, yeah.
happened. And that all takes time. So you may be a ways into the IR before you realize, somebody getting into your system isn't necessarily material if there was not a breach of
Great
information
example of this.
involved with
I have a
this.
great,
Or if they breach your web server and all they got was the data that's on your public website, that's not material, but at the same time, you're still gonna run an incident response to respond to this and investigate to make sure that that's what happened and understand with reasonable certainty that that's all
oh,
that
yeah. Let me
happened.
give you an example of that then. We just had this happen with a smaller organization, about 40 people on staff. There was a breach. Like, what if it was a credential harvesting, access token harvesting phishing email that a chief executive had clicked. They had not implemented phishing resistant MFA, and they broke into his Microsoft account. And they got access to M365. He was fairly far up in the company. He was, I think, he was either the COO or the COO at the time. I have to look back at my notes, but they got a decent ways through. But that incident wasn't material. Guess why? They didn't use their Microsoft except for Azure. They were completely a Google Workspace shop. So
Mhm.
all the data warehousing, all the email, everything
Exactly.
lived in a totally separate platform. So we were able to determine pretty quickly there's no breach here, right? Like there's literally no data for them to take. This is not
Yep.
material. That's a very easy one to say, okay, not material, no need for IR, no need for forensics. We kick the hackers out and we move on with our life, right? Probably putting in a plan for some kind of phishing resistant MFA mechanism in the near future. Um,
Yeah.
as opposed to if you,
And we've been a bit in the weeds here too. I suppose we probably should back up. We have, sort of three classifications. We have events, something that is unexpected. You have an incident, something that is an event that then impacts the confidentiality, availability, or integrity
well,
of
and remember,
information or systems, and then you have breaches, which is now somebody has had unauthorized access to this sensitive data and is now leaking it or, exposing it, externally. So, I think that's important to kind of draw those distinctions through here as well, that just because something is an event or an incident doesn't necessarily make them a reportable thing, and that it's only when you get to you have to determine, was this a breach potentially. Now, also, what is material may differ from business to business, industry to industry, based on the type of data that's in use and the type of tooling that's in use and the organizational structure. I mean, there's a lot of variables here. Like you said, they only used that account for this one thing over here. It wasn't even connected to this, so it didn't end up being material, but that was because of the way that individual organization was using those tools and had segregated
yep.
their account.
So
They were
we have a question here
prepared
or a comment.
in their program.
Philip Swaim says within a day of an incident being recognized, one should most likely know if the incident rises to the level of materiality. You have 4 days from there. You should be able to contain at least within 4 days and prepare a statement for what you know so far. I kind of like that. I don't know if I'm 100% on.
This is Phil's bag, so I'm gonna defer to Phil. I know
But I do
Phil.
like how he's saying that
So
too. Like
yeah.
he's right, right? Like it doesn't have to be comprehensive on the disclosure. Now, I think the rub's going to be a lot of companies like this. I mean, disclosing a data breach in any shape or form is not small potatoes when it comes to a PR relations, right? It can be a nightmare. So there is going to be emphasis on providing as much data as we can to portray our, we did everything we could, proactiveness. Like that is part of this equation here that the lawyers and PR people are going to be wrangling their hands about at this point, right? Like we don't have enough data to go on the record saying, hey, we did our best we could, or we thwarted it in this way, or we managed it in this way. That does paint a very poor light that may or may not be fairly justified. Let's go into the next thing here too, because AK is a beast, and I agree with Phil. I think after reading it again, like you should know if you have any kind of risk management program, any kind of SOC ops, any kind of even even if you only have an internal IT team that's using like a SOC as a service, right? You should know fairly within 4 days that this incident was material, right? Like data was impacted that is not kosher. PII is a great litmus test. If PII was impacted, personally identifiable information, that's addresses, date of birth, emails, social security numbers, of course, all that stuff in significant levels. Yeah, that's material. You need to go with it. And I'd like to touch on this next thing real quick with you. The term material. It's an audit term, to be clear, right? Like it is an audit term. If you're building your risk register, you're going to determine inside your risk register what you constitute for your organization specifically as material. That being said, there's also, and again, asterisk, not a lawyer, please talk to your general counsel, but based on my understanding, there is a legal connotation for the word material when it comes to publicly traded companies, securities, and stocks. What's the definition that you read? You told me this definition the other day, and I loved it. What is
Yeah, we've had chatter in the security field, because folks feel like this is really squishy, but it has been defined. Would a reasonable investor consider this information to be important? Would it significantly affect their decision to invest in this company, this security?
Yeah.
I mean, that reasonable investor test is kind of what's defined by the. It sounds really vague, but at the same time, this has been used in court. I remember, in my business coursework, business law stuff, like, the reasonable person test is pretty common in law from what I understand. And so when you get into courts, like it's not nearly as squishy as, the cybersecurity pros want to make this out to be.
Especially with securities law. Like anything that does with like publicly traded stocks, securities, like financial fraud is as old as time immemorial. We've have literally a century of precedent law now behind that and various things. Like if it's a material incident and I wouldn't want to invest with you, and we get it, that's super subjective. But me personally, I could say, if you had any kind of breach that affected PII and the report came out that you were handling it less than great, I might think twice about investing with you. I think a jury of my peers would be in a similar boat if we went to court on that.
Yeah. And I do want to point out, as I mentioned before, like you don't want to be figuring out how to do these things when they're happening. Like you don't want to be figuring out how to respond to an incident when you're in the middle of one. You don't want to be trying to figure out how to define something is material in the middle of all of this. So what this really comes down to is your organization really must implement these capabilities to determine materiality into the risk management program now, like ahead of time.
And for
like
those
policies and the procedures so that you can define the standards that are applicable in the context of your business so that then you can reliably comply with that policy. Like you've got to have this governance in place to make sure that the organization can apply on the or can comply with this.
So remember, our audience isn't all security professionals. I think we need to pause here for a second.
Right.
I know we've gotten to the weeds, and those of you who bear with us for this, when we got into the weeds, thank you. Thank you so much for bearing with us. A lot of people would naturally ask the question, well, if we don't define materiality, doesn't that give us more room to maneuver? And the answer is no. Like if you don't define this, that under any, because we're talking about this court precedent's been set when it comes to materiality, and my 2 cents on this, again, not a lawyer, that's a form of negligence. And that allows the SEC to make the determination, was this material or not. You don't want the SEC being the sole judge on whether or not things material after post-mortem. You need to figure this out beforehand so that you can make the argument, no, because there's going to be gray. There's always going to be gray. There always is. But if an event that's gray that ends up, not being so great after the fact, you want to be able to point back to your risk registry, maybe point back to what you defined as being material and say, look, we reasonably made the assumption it wasn't material based on these parameters that we set up, and we have all the documentation to prove it. We get it. It ended up being material, but it wasn't from a lack of good faith from our part. That's a big part of your defense here.
Yeah, you've gotta be able to show, and like I tell my son when I'm helping him with his math homework, you gotta be able to show your work. You gotta show how you determined this was material or not in this. And when in doubt, engage with your legal counsel. And my advice is it's gonna be best to err to the side of transparency. If you've got to decide,
Well, speaking of
what is and what isn't.
transparency, let's talk about the Form 10Ks. The SEC is setting up some guardrails to make sure that at least some steps are made in this direction, and that is in the form of the annual Form 10K filing. 10K has a lot in there. We're not going to go through everything. So I'm going to focus on 4 key points. There is more in it, and you should definitely look at it with your legal counsel. And if you don't have someone who can help you review on the cybersecurity side of things, there is a nice little QR code in our top screen. Right, hang on, this way. Up here, if you would like to meet with us, we're happy to give you a consultation free of charge. But that being said, the processes for assessing, identifying, and managing material risks need to be defined, and they need to be included in your 10 form. Like, what is your broad parameters of how you define cybersecurity threat risks? Risks from already that have happened on a cybersecurity threat, whether it's inside your company or macro level, is my understanding. So, great example, this is a supply chain risk. Maybe we were dealing with the oh gosh, what was it? What was the big bug? The Move It breach is a great example of that. A
Mhm.
lot of publicly traded companies got caught in the Move It breach. It wasn't their fault. It was a very popular used protocol, but they got supply chain pwned down the wazoo. There's still stuff coming out of that in the legal pipelines. If you got caught in that through no fault of your own, you need to put that on this Form 10K saying that could be a material risk that materializes down the road. The board of directors oversight of cybersecurity risk, they want to know, this one's a little loose based on my reading. They want to know what kind of cybersecurity background member of your, at least one member of your board has for the oversight. Now, I do know that's not very well defined yet. I'm seeing a lot of publicly traded companies finding people with more of a technology background than security background who can kind of fill in the holes in the oversight. That's common. This is very new. That doesn't surprise me. I do expect the parameters of what they're going to expect to go on the board of directors in terms of expertise to probably tighten as time goes on. Would you
Yeah.
agree with that?
I think so.
Yeah.
Earlier this summer, I think earlier drafts of this, they were going to require somebody with cyber expertise on the board, and they've softened that a little bit. But now you need to tell them about what the expertise is, but they're not making it a hard requirement that you must
Like,
have somebody.
they're not ready to go to, you need a CISSP on your board, right? Like, that's not where we're at.
Right.
But there needs to be some kind of reasonableness. Like, hey, this person has a background in technology, whether a former CIO, a former CTO, an advisory of some sort, where they're experienced in this area, or at least they can hold a conversant conversation, right? In this field, I think that's what they're really setting the peg at the moment. And then last but not least is obviously the management of the company, the C-level executives and down, their role and expertise in assessing and managing cybersecurity threats. Do you have the resources internally, whether through external vendors or with internal staff, to properly run this program? They want to see broad strokes. You do. And I do MSSP for publicly traded companies. You can use an outside role, but usually we also list the in-house person who's our point of contact and their bona fides as well, right? Like that's part of the 10K filing.
Yep. And they're getting you to put these roles and responsibilities and accountability in writing
Yep.
with that requirement.
Uh-huh. Absolutely. So, I mean, areas of impact, and we're going to move along here because we're at the last 7 minutes of our call, and I want to make sure we have time to talk about the rest of it. But, I mean, there's going to be more compliance burden. If you haven't figured that out yet, it's coming. It's here. The focus really is on incident response. What will you do when this happens versus what, it happened, now what do we do? They want you to change the tone and the tense of the words you're using. There's going to be a lot of heightened emphasis on vendor management. Supply chain risks are an ever-growing threat. You need to properly vet your vendors. I know it's not they're all be all, and a lot of people will say you need to have more than this, but we're SOC 2 Type 2 now. One of the main things we had to do to achieve that compliance is I had to go through a list of all of our key vendors that have any access to any kind of materiality and data for our customers or ourselves and audit them. I had to ask for their SOC 2 or Type 2 reports. I had to send the questionnaires, do VCSO. That is a bare expectation now. You can't just say, oh, I put the data, for example, on this vendor. It's their problem now. No, you need to do due diligence. You can't predict everything, but you need to do due diligence to make sure they have a semblance of their house in order. And as much guarantee as you can get out of that within your means. All right, let me go to the last one. And then, of course, innovation in cybersecurity technologies. There's a lot of logistical challenges that are going to come out of this. I am fully expecting there to be some really cool solutions out there that are going to come materiality or not materiality. They're going to materialize because we're talking about a lot, and I think the burden's only going to grow. So they're going to free markets are always my favorite solution to the plethora of my problems. I think the free market's going to move here. Businesses are going to be forced to innovate and invest in new technologies and strategies just to be able to manage this stuff. And
Mhm.
even if they're already doing a good job, there's going to be future investment they got to make. I don't want to tell executives how to run their job. If you're looking to cut your security program budget, good luck. It's. I don't think you're going to have a good time with that. This is not the season of the world we're entering in for that particular phase of business life. All right, let's move on to the next slide. So, I mean, why would we even do this, right? Well, other than the Form 10K, which you do have to file as a requirement per year, there are implications about not doing this properly. I'm staying the heck away from fear of uncertainty and doubt. But this is not uncertain and this is not doubt. This happened. A ransomware gang, and I think what was the name of the vendor? I'm trying to remember what their name was. But there was a publicly traded company they hacked back in December, and the publicly traded company refused to play ball. The ransomware gang filed a filing on the SEC's website reporting, basically tattling on the publicly traded company saying, we hacked them, we have evidence, we did all this stuff. They didn't do anything and they didn't report themselves. Now, I think it was November, sorry, forgive me, November. Now, to be fair, the rules hadn't gone into effect yet, so there really wasn't any, ramifications for that specific scenario. But the criminals on the commercialized side of cybercrime are absolutely going to use this as additional leverage to force companies to play ball with them. Ransomware at the end of the day is just a new form of blackmail. This is just another tool, unfortunately, that we're going to see hackers exploiting inevitably. So you want to be in front of this because transparency, again, I don't think majority of people would ever hide it, but for those bad actors, even they're going to have to play ball with transparency because if they don't disclose, somebody else will. You're not going to be able to hide this. And there's personal consequences. This got the security community in a giant uproar, and for good reason. Yeah, Meridian Link. Thank you, Philip. I knew I had it blocked out by my face on the camera, and I couldn't think of it at the top of my head. Meridian Link was the name of the company. I don't know how I feel about this. I don't like it. I know that, but beyond that, this is just a rat's nest of a situation. So the SEC, let's back up. About 3 years ago, there was a pretty big incident that majority of the security people on this live stream will be familiar with, which was the SolarWinds Orion breach. It was a pretty popular tool used for network management and a whole bunch of IT fleet management in terms of like asset management across. So federal government was using it and multiple agencies, large Fortune 500 companies were using it in their IT departments. Speaking of supply chain attacks, it was breached. And criminal attackers who to this day, I don't think we've attributed any kind of attacker. The attribution has not been defined, but attackers by all accounts, managed to run off with a significant amount of sensitive data, including things that could potentially impact national security. It was not a good time. So the SEC apparently spent the last 3 years investigating that entire incident and determined not only was SolarWinds, and by their account, fraudulent to their investors because they were negligent in managing their cyber risk to the point where it adversely affected their offering, but they charged Timothy Brown, CISO of SolarWinds, individually with fraud as well. And that was the game changer. We just don't see that outside of financial fraud. Like, unless you are embezzling, this just doesn't tend to happen. This is the first, to my knowledge, where this has happened. I know we had the Uber CISO a while ago, but there was the argument he made that he did lie on FTC papers, right? Like that is a thing. What are your thoughts on that? As a CISO right now, what are your thoughts
Yeah.
on that?
You got to represent your program accurately. And I think the thing that worries me about this precedent is there's a lot of folks who are security officers of organizations who are not C-suite level
Mhm.
peers with the other folks in the executive suite. And maybe they're a senior manager or a director level or something, a few levels down in the organization. And there's a lot of pressure on them to present things in ways that aren't going to make the the VPs or the execs look bad to the board or what have you. So this is kind of scary for folks that are security officers in orgs, especially those that are buried down in the org, especially where they're dealing with a lot of organizational politics and that kind of stuff, and may not have the maturity uh, to be able to stand up and represent things and articulate things
I'm seeing
accurately.
I'm seeing an alarming trend of indemnification for most CISOs I'm aware of, and honestly, if I were in their shoes, I'd probably do the same thing. For those of you who aren't familiar with the term, indemnification basically means if in the course of my duties I incur some kind of legal penalty, whether it's civilly or criminally, the company that I represent steps
Mhm.
up and pays my legal fines, right? Like they fund the lawyers, they pay the court costs, they absorb as much of the burden as humanly and logistically possible. And I'm seeing more and more CISOs just demand that because they can see the writing on the wall, right? Like for the longest time,
And insurance.
yeah, insurance too, right? Like insurance, man. The day we have a material event with cyber insurance, like and I mean material, I mean like the world, like global cyber insurance program is threatened.
Yeah.
That is,
Oh, no, I'm referring to, like, directors and
oh
officers.
yeah, directors and officers, absolutely. Sorry, I thought you were talking about like insurance as a whole. Yeah, we can go in there if you want, but it probably will happen eventually, and it's not going to be fun. But anywho, long story short, the indemnification thing, they're just insisting that as part of their contract because they know, I think deep down, sooner or later, they're running a risk right now, and one of them is going to get popped in the course of their duties. And I don't think it's necessarily due to what anything they've done. It comes back to what we were talking before. Risk management has to be a CXO position in management, at least in participation. You have to have engagement and you have to have the ear. There is a growing philosophy right now, and I know some people are against it and some people are for it. So I'm not saying which way to go. That traditionally you'd have the CISO report to the CIO or the CTO, and the CTO, CIO would sit on the board level, right? More and more people are just saying full out the CISO needs to have a seat at the table because a lot of times, especially like in the CIO position, by their philosophical nature, depending on the organization, they're inherently conflicting. The CIO is about making things smoother, more efficient, about trying to make everything flow as quickly as possible to achieve business goals as quick as possible. And the CISO is acting as the very necessary brakes to the organization. Hey, hold on a second. We need to slow down. We need to do this properly. We need to manage our risk a little more. You need gas and brakes in the car. You don't want the brakes to report to the
Yeah.
gas pedal. Like that's not how this works. So I can see that argument growing and taking off. Like bare minimum, I think those are two things we're going to see in the industry.
Yep.
What do you think?
And well, and by putting the CISO at that level, like, they've got visibility now into sort of the high level business objectives of what's going on, and it helps them be more collaborative. Like I was saying earlier, instead of pushing back and constantly telling people no, understanding what you're trying to accomplish and helping them do it safely is huge.
Huge.
But but the other piece of this though is you've got to institutionalize your program. Like, it's an anti-pattern to consolidate or concentrate your security program and ownership and accountability and everything into just one person or one team. It's got to be owned by everybody. Each function and line of business has to own their pieces. The security officer doesn't own the risk for the business. The business has to own the risk. The business leaders who are making the decision, the security team, security officer can present them with information to make the decision. Like what Becky was asking about earlier, we can help them document and inform and guide and help them make a decision. The security officer is going to build a program that facilitates managing risk. They're going to collaborate with these other business stakeholders to manage risk and come up with solutions that enable the business instead of creating friction. They're going to provide input and guidance into how these risks are evaluated, and at the end of the day, support documenting all of these risks, as well as like business aligned risk treatment strategies and risk acceptances. They got to get all this stuff documented, but at the end of the day, the executives are accountable for the risk management decisions that they make, not
I,
the CISO,
yeah, and Philip
but
asks who's
all of the
Philip
executives.
asked quite. I think this is a great way to summarize this. He asked who's signing these forms, right? The AK and 10K. We're specifically on that, right? Like who's the one signing it? He's seen an AK sign from a VF Corp today, or he saw from VF Corp sign AK today, and it was Chief Legal that signed the form, right? Like it's probably the right move, to be honest. Like I think that's the best case scenario an organization should look at when they submit any kind of filing. I would say maybe an argument you made for like this the COO is the operational person signing it, but I think chief legal 9 times out of 10 is probably going to be the person that signs off on that and puts their name on the line. I would not have. If anyone's watching this as an organization and they ask you to sign these forms and you're mid management, like a director of cybersecurity, something like that, who's not the C-level executive, do not sign that form. That is my personal opinion. I wouldn't sign that form. To talk to general counsel, of course, but it should be a CXO, preferably chief legal officer, in my humble opinion, that signs that. All right, let's talk. We've had a lot of scary talks today, so I like to talk about being proactive, right? And that's what the focus of today's call is: being proactive. And we're guys. Thank you for staying over. We're going a little over time, but I think this last part's worth it. So if you can stick around for another 5 minutes, we're gonna hopefully paint you in the right direction to go. So what should businesses do? I really think it boils down to, and we could flesh these out way more intelligently and more sophisticatedly. But it boils down to five key things. They need to take a holistic and business centric approach to security. Like it needs to be, like you said, a mature program that is not just one guy sitting in a corner running everything. It needs to be throughout the entire business. The needs of the business need to be considered in the program, and contribution from the entire business and various forms of participation needs to be achieved. You need to improve on the business processes that monitor and improve your organization's overall cybersecurity posture. The days of going out, and I'm probably preaching to the choir on this call, of buying an antivirus from your local big box store and saying that's our company antivirus and that's our security. Those are long over, like 10 years plus over now. And honestly, the current mitigations that we have and strategies that we have in a lot of cases might be found insufficient to be able to meet these kind of demands. It's time to go ahead and look at improving not only the technology that we're using, but the processes of how we manage that technology into people and business objectives. We touched on this a lot, but cybersecurity risk management needs to be some form of CXO business function, whether that's participation from an existing CXO officer or officers, or elevating, like we talked about, CISO, Chief Security Officer level position to that leadership team. That needs to be there. Transparency, you want to be transparent here. It for Darwinian reasons of just survival, but also because it's the right thing to do. Um, you do not want to try to hide the ball in any way, shape, or form. With the current climate, it will get out. We've already seen hackers reporting people to the SEC with details of how they've accomplished the breach. We do not want to be anything less than perfectly transparent in every way, shape, or form. Again, talk to your chief legal officer, talk to your general counsel before you do any kind of disclosure statements or go, well, Rambo with this kind of stuff. But being transparent on a philosophical level and a tactical level really matters here. And my last thing, the real gut of where you should start at. And it doesn't matter if you've already done this in the past. Things have changed, even in the last month. Now we got this new 8K, 10K form thing. There's going to be more changes down the road. You should perform on a regular basis a cybersecurity risk assessment on the business. It needs to, and that's really what I'm going to drill down on here and talk about a little more. So there's tons of people out there. And I actually do, and I know I'm biased for saying it, I recommend using an outside party for the cybersecurity risk assessment at least once, because getting an outside perspective sometimes helps you see things that naturally in the day-to-day function of the business might be missed. It's nobody's fault. It's just we tend to tune out noise, right? Like if we're constantly bombarded of noise, some stuff automatically kind of goes into our blind spot. Having an outside opinion, great example of this, Matt, when we did our pre-assessment for SOC 2, what did we do? We brought you on. Could we have maybe muddled through SOC 2 Type 2 on our own? Probably, maybe. We're fairly smart over here, but that wasn't the value. The value was you're an outsider coming in, looking over our security controls and saying, hey, here's my take on it as someone who's just coming in the cold. Here's what you look great at. Here's what probably needs a little bit of work. And you pointed out things that were totally missed, not by negligence, just by, hey, he's right. Like we never considered that. So I do.
And we accelerated the outcome.
Yeah.
For the amount of time you had to invest,
Yeah.
You didn't have to spend a huge amount of time on it, and we were able to wrap it up within, what, 3, 4 weeks?
Yeah. I think it was like actually 3 days of sitting down with you for like on an engineering level, and then back and forth on email for 2 or 3 weeks, and we were done. It was very efficient, and that's why I've been proposing here. So, what does a proper cybersecurity risk assessment look like? First off, this is professional and consulting engagement. It investigates your current security position. It is going to touch on what the most likely at-risk business assets are going to be. Like we said, every business is different. We want to touch on risk that is most applicable to them and for highlight more severe risks in the report. We'll look for procedural or cultural weaknesses that might be exploited to enabling or futuring attack. If you have a process, great example of this that every business should do, wire transferring on your account receivable, account payable. Put a formal policy in place of controls of multiple people on who gets payments sent out to them. Business email compromise is a thing. People are fraudulently wiring money every day to hackers all over the world, or even in our own backyard. Put a policy in place that multiple eyes touch any new outbound wire transfers or any updated wire for transfers that are changing account numbers, new vendors, etc. Put that in place. We look for stuff like that. Our cybersecurity assessment is based on NIST. Personally, if you were to go with my firm or Matt's firm, I think you'd be in the same boat if you did this. It's tactical for sure. We're an MSSP, but I think a lot of times when you're starting out, tactical is good. Like, let's start with the broad, like the nuts and bolts, and then drill down. We base these following criteria against NIST standards. So we first obviously meet with the executive team. We talk about CXO participation. Someone in leadership's got to be engaged in this assessment, and we're not asking them for an undue amount of time. Basically, for our assessment process, we usually spend a couple hours drilling down on general business policies. Like it's an hour and a half call. They'll tend to not have all the answers, and that's fine. They'll go ping the chief legal counsel or something like that, or they'll ping the director of the tech department for the policies on like the WISP is a great example, right? Like maybe they have the WISP, but they don't have the data processing side of the thing. Okay, get that over to us. And then we go and review all that after the discovery call. That's a security policy. If you have a physical environment, not everybody does, obviously, in the world we live in, we do want to make sure there's nothing crazy with that. Generally, I want to look around, basic low hanging fruit. Nobody's sticky noting passwords to their computers on their monitors, right? Like little stuff like that, but also more subtle stuff. We'll look at network and data. Network for this one, it's kind of hard to put. I also put SaaS architecture in here, Matt. I think that data warehousing is important, and a lot of people have replaced SaaS architecture for their traditional network when it comes to data warehousing. But SaaS architecture has its own unique pitfalls. API lockdowns, for example, making sure your API is properly secured, making sure that there's no publicly disclosed, vulnerabilities on the back in terms of like file shares being open to the internet. Making sure MFA conditional access policies are applied if you're using Microsoft, for example. The list goes on and on. And if you have a traditional network, obviously, we'll make sure your firewalls, your routing tables are set up correctly. Look at making sure the whole thing's holistic. There's no obvious issues. On the network side, I'm looking for things stupid and I'm looking for things subtle. Stupid being you left RDP open on a public port and it's pointed on actual port 3389, right? Port 3389. Yeah, I don't want port 3389 ever open, ever. But then we go and drill down. Is there any vulnerabilities you need to be aware of on the firewall you're using? Is there anything that's critical that needs to be addressed immediately? Is there some low stuff that can be added to the patch schedule, et cetera, et cetera? User systems, dark web. Dark web, we do want to look at. Dark web is super heavily over marketed, in my opinion, but it does have its place. Specifically, looking at popped passwords, if you're still using passwords at your organization, making sure those aren't being reused in the environment on critical systems. I had an organization where the admin account they thought was a great password. It was literally like 26 characters long. They came up with it. The problem is they used it for several key systems on multiple things, and they had been using it for like 7 years. And guess what? It had been popped in a data breach at one point, and nobody told them. Like, yeah, it's just sitting here on a forum on the dark web. Like, we control it, we can crawl it, and this is old data, right? Like, once it's publicly available like that, it's been auctioned out the wazoo. So, I want to go change that as soon as possible, Mr. CFO, sir. Oh man, that was a funny conversation. I shouldn't laugh. It was actually they managed to remediate it. It was good. They were in a good spot. It was just awkward to bring up. And then last but not least, the team behavior test. I'm not talking about full-blown penetration testing. That is a whole separate gig. But I want to see how the organization reacts to realistic phishing simulations, some social engineering stuff. Great example, if I call your chief accounts payable person, can I convince them over the phone to set me up as a vendor, right? Without any prior documentation or authorization. I've done that. I've actually done that, Matt. I've done that where I've gotten the accounts payable person to believe I'm a vendor. Another thing is like sending out phishing emails, kind of get you to click on something you shouldn't and go somewhere you shouldn't, type your credentials into something you shouldn't. Very basic stuff, but it kind of gives that street level awareness test, is what I call it. Like, is your staff mostly street savvy? We do expect a little bit of failure in that range, and that's okay. Like, we're not expecting 100%. But if half your staff falls for a single test of phishing emails, you probably got an educational awareness problem. You need to address that ASAP.
Yep.
And so that basically boils down to when we have all that data, what do we do with it? Well, you get a big fancy report, of course. We're going to give you that. But more importantly, we sit you down with that, again, that CXO relationship, that empathetic, we're talking to you about stuff and we're saying, look, in a way that you can understand, here's what we believe are the biggest risks. Here's the context of why they're a risk in a way that the C-level executive suites can understand and act on. And here's what we recommend you probably should do. And we leave it up to you at that point, right? Like, as a consultant, it's your security team, or if you don't have a security team proper, it's your executive team's decision on how they want to go. If you would like to engage us at that point, we're more than happy. But if you feel like you can handle it, great. And we move on, and hopefully you'll engage us again in the future for another assessment. But that's how I view a proper risk assessment from a third party looking like. Do you have anything to add there?
Um, no, it works pretty well. The way that I generally do the framework assessments is very similar. You tend to get more into the technical
I'm
weeds,
very
where I
tactical.
focus more
I'm
on,
very
a
tactical.
high level program and governance, uh, but also do mock audits, and we add in where we may go and actually collect evidence the same way an auditor would
I like
to get them to prove. But most times with these, we take things at face value, and tend to coach leadership that's bringing us in, whoever the executive sponsor is, to set the expectation with our team that, like, this is internal. This is not, to get anybody in trouble. We need to
that.
be transparent and honest with ourselves to understand where we are today. And we're going to get better results and more actionable information out of this if we're not trying to worry about hiding stuff because we're going to get in trouble. So anytime you do something like this, I think it's the biggest thing for leadership to know is, like, they need to set the expectation with a team that, like, this isn't to get people in trouble. You're not going to be in trouble with the findings of this. This is purely to make us better, so that people aren't worried about, gosh, if I tell them the truth, I'm going to lose my job.
This is
And
knowledge is power. Knowledge is power. We're
yeah,
not here to shame anybody, and nor should the leadership shoot to shame for anybody. Like, that is not the objective here.
no,
We are looking honestly at ourselves and saying, okay, are
mhm,
we doing a good job? And is there area to improve? The answer is there area to improve? There always is area to improve. But are we in a place where we're that risk tolerance level we talked about before, right? Like, are we in a place where the amount of risk that we're retaining is acceptable to us? We're not losing sleep over, and we're proactively engaging that on a regular basis, to where we're keeping it at that level. I actually am a believer of what you talked about, and what I do is complementary, because I think risk assessments are kind of fun in that sometimes you find out stuff in the initial risk assessment. You're like, we need to drill down on this deeper. And it requires a
yeah,
more tailored approach, because, for a great example of this, we find out, you're not centralizing your policy documentation anywhere. It's kind of spread out all over the place. If you had an auditor come and ask you, hey, I need this in 5 business days, and you can't materialize that, well, we probably need to do the exercise of finding all that and putting it in a central location that's properly locked down, controlled, and distributed, and then B, running that exercise, like you said, like, okay, we already found out we had a gap here. Let's run the exercise and see what other gaps that we have. I think that the more you do in this area, the better business outcomes you're going to have, the better conversations you're going to have with leadership at the company, because they understand risk. I think one thing that all executives understand to one degree or another is risk versus reward, and how to weigh that. That's part of what makes them that C-level suite. And then you're going to have, through those conversations, more impact. Like, if your goal here is, I really want to do well at this organization, I really want to do well at my job, and make sure they're in a good place, this is a great place to start, because it starts the conversation and gets the ball rolling. And then you'll find, once that ball's rolling, it tends to snowball as long as it's done properly, right? Like, you gain traction, the program picks up, it matures. It's just good for the organization. It's
yeah.
good for you. It's good for everyone. Okay, we went 20 minutes over, but I was having a blast. This is why I like hanging out with you, Matt. You were always
Mhm,
like
great.
super fun. If people want to find you, right? Like, where should they look?
Yeah. You can find me on LinkedIn, Matt Garish, or M Garish or MP Garish. I'm not sure
Remember Matt
which my
Garrish?
handle is, but if you find me, you can find me there. There aren't many Matt Garishes out there. Focivity as well. You can find on LinkedIn or Twitter, and also my podcast, the Mindful Business Security Show. And as soon as we wrap this, I'm going to go record an episode of that. Uh, so that is a call-in radio show style podcast for business leaders, business owners, to learn about security and to be understanding what are the things we should be thinking about. So, Mindful SMB Show on Twitter and LinkedIn and technically Facebook, but there's I try to stay off Facebook.
Yeah, I do too. Honestly, I'm not ashamed to admit this. You didn't hear this yet. The Facebook part of this live stream totally broke. I have no idea why. It was set up. I tested it an hour for the stream, and the page said, "Yep, error." So if you tried to tune in on Facebook to watch this first, I'm sorry. I think most of our audience is watching from LinkedIn. My name is Logan Edmonds. I'm CEO of TTS. We're an MSSP, a managed service security provider. And we do a little bit of everything. Mostly we do managed SOC ops, managed security programs on the tactical side. We also do a little bit of IT system integration consulting. If you want to connect with us to learn about risk assessment or some other project or issue you have, we have a pretty special offer today. You can see it down here in the bottom of the banner. You can see it up here in the top left-hand corner of the video. We're giving away 15 minutes of one of our team's time, no strings, no obligation, just literally you want to workshop something, you have a question about something that you can address on this webinar, you pick. That link takes you to a calendar. You pick a time that works best for you. It sends a Zoom link to you and one of our key team members that can answer those questions, and hopefully we can get you taken care of and on the right track here. I also do have a podcast as well, though I'm not nearly as polished as Matt. You can check out the Binary Business Show. We go every other week on Fridays on LinkedIn, on Facebook, and on YouTube. You can also find a copy on our website or at bbs.tabernacle.tech. BBS, that's B as in boy, .tabernacle.tech. We try to interview engaging co-hosts like Matt. Matt, you were actually, I think, our very first episode. We tried to engage. Yeah, you really were.
Oh, wow.
Looking back, I was like, that's the first one we went live on a bi-weekly basis. It's really cool to hear about walks of life from various people as it relates to cyber and tech. We've had HR professionals, we've had lawyers. It's been good. So, yeah. Well, guys, stay safe out there. Have a great weekend. It is 4:30 my time, and my wife says we need to go to dinner, so I'm out. Take care.
There we go. See ya. I'm going to jet too.
Bye.